Dad said, "Adults and real grandkids only." After seating my son at a different table, he ate by himself as others laughed. I went and sat with him. When the $290 check came, I paid only for us. Dad's smile disappeared on the spot. It was my dad Frank's 62nd birthday dinner, and the hostess walked us down toward a private room in the back of the restaurant, the kind of place that tries a little too hard to feel fancy. There was a table set for 8 with crisp white tablecloths and those over-the-top folded napkins that looked like someone needed an engineering degree to make them. Ben was right next to me as we walked, 7 years old, wearing a blue striped shirt that was tucked in neatly on one side and slipping loose on the other because he'd been proud to do it himself that morning. Frank and my mom Linda were already seated when we arrived, along with my sister Emily, her husband Kyle, and their kids Lucy and Evan, all dressed up like it was a holiday card photo. Candles were already standing tall on a cake nearby, waiting for the big moment. Off to the side, closer to the kitchen doors, sat a smaller table with just 2 place settings, close enough that you couldn't miss it, but far enough away to make the message clear. Ben naturally headed toward the main table where his cousins were, reaching for the chair next to Evan, when Frank's hand shot out and stopped the chair cold. "Easy there, champ," he said, and Ben looked up at him. "This table is for adults and real grandkids," Frank added, like he was explaining something obvious. "And you get that, right?" He pointed toward the smaller table and said Ben would be more comfortable over there. The whole room seemed to freeze, with Linda suddenly very interested in her menu, Emily fussing with Lucy's hair bow, and Kyle staring down at his phone like it might save him. Ben's face went blank in that way he has when he tries to take up less space, a trick no 7-year-old should already know. "Grandpa, why can't?" Lucy started to ask, before Frank cut her off with a sharp hush and pulled out his chair to sit down, waving at the empty seat beside him and telling me to come on. I looked from Ben to that lonely little table by the kitchen and then back at my father settling in like he'd just solved a minor inconvenience. And without saying a word, I walked over to the small table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Emily asked what I was doing, sounding confused, but I didn't answer her. I just patted the seat across from me. Ben came over, climbed into the chair, and carefully smoothed his napkin the way I'd shown him before. Frank snapped that I was being ridiculous and reminded me it was his birthday and that I should be sitting with the family, and I calmly told him I was sitting at the family table, right where my son was. He cut Linda off when she started to speak and said he'd arrange things so the kids could sit together and I could relax. And if I wanted to be difficult, that was my problem, using that word like it explained everything. The server showed up then and took drink orders, wine and craft beer for everyone else, while I asked for water for both of us. Conversation at the main table picked right back up, Frank rambling about golf, Emily laughing too loudly, Lucy and Evan coloring on their placemats, and not a single person looking our way. We were only 10 feet apart, but it felt like we were in another restaurant entirely. When the food came, Ben quietly cut his chicken fingers into small bites and ate without a word, never asking why Grandpa had made him sit apart, because deep down he already knew. I thought about the day the adoption became official 3 years earlier, how Frank had congratulated me, but still called Ben your kid instead of our grandson. About the Christmas mornings where Lucy and Evan tore into big, flashy gifts while Ben got a $20 gift card. And about Lucy's birthday party last month when Ben was told to help Grandma in the kitchen during the family photo. None of it was big on its own, just a lot of small cuts and quiet reminders that I kept telling myself would stop if I didn't push back, and I realized how wrong I'd been. Ben finally spoke up in a small voice and asked why Grandpa didn't like him. And I set my fork down and looked at this kid who'd spent 2 years in foster care before I brought him home, who still woke up from nightmares, and who was just starting to trust that this family was forever. I told him Grandpa had his own stuff to work through and that it wasn't about him. But Ben reminded me that Frank said he wasn't a real grandkid. And when I said Frank was wrong, Ben pointed out that he wasn't related by blood like Lucy and Evan. I told him family isn't just blood, it's about who shows up, and he looked over at the main table where everyone was laughing at something Frank said and quietly noted that they weren't sitting with us. I agreed, and he went back to his food without crying, just accepting it in a way that hurt worse than tears. Dessert came out next, a big chocolate cake with candles at the main table, while everyone sang and Frank made his wish and cut the first slice. And then a smaller piece was dropped at our table without any song or fuss. Ben ate it quietly. When the check arrived in its leather folder and landed in front of Frank, he opened it, glanced at the total, and slid it toward me like he always did. The same move he'd pulled at every family dinner for the past year, whether it was his birthday, Linda's birthday, or a random weeknight. I pulled the folder back, opened it, and saw the total, then counted out enough cash for 2 entrees, 2 waters, 2 desserts, and the tip, and slid that money inside. I stood up, asked Ben if he was ready, and when he nodded and climbed down from his chair, Linda called my name in a shaky voice. I walked over to the main table, set the folder down in front of Frank, and told him there was cash for Ben and me and that the rest was on him. His smile locked in place as he asked what I meant, and I told him he wanted separate tables, so now he had separate bills. Emily stared at me like I'd lost my mind, and when Frank opened the folder and saw the small stack of bills next to the much bigger total, he reminded me it was his birthday, to which I told him happy birthday and explained he'd made his choice just like he had with the seating. Linda offered her credit card, but Frank snapped that he wasn't letting me walk out because he hurt my feelings, and I corrected him by saying he hadn't hurt my feelings. He'd told my son he wasn't real family, and that showed me exactly where we stood. I took Ben's hand and started walking as Frank shouted after me that I was embarrassing him, but I didn't stop, moving through the private room, past other tables where families were actually eating together, and out the front door the hostess kindly held open. In the parking lot, I buckled Ben into his seat and started the car while he stared out the window, and when I apologized over and over, he asked if they were going to be mad and if I'd get in trouble. I told him I was 32 and didn't get in trouble anymore, and when he said Grandpa was really mad, I told him Grandpa could be mad. Nothing really changed after that, and I pulled out of the parking lot while the restaurant faded behind us, watching people move around through the windows of that private room and guessing they were probably trying to figure out how to split a $240 bill. Ben broke the silence and said my name, and when I answered, he thanked me for sitting with him, and something shifted deep in my chest, like a door opening that should have been unlocked years ago. I told him always, no matter what, and I meant it. We drove home, went through the normal routine, Ben changing into pajamas, brushing his teeth, climbing into bed, and I sat on the edge and asked if he was okay, checking twice, because I needed to hear it. He said Grandpa could be mean sometimes, and that he was used to it, and hearing a 7-year-old say he was used to being treated that way made my stomach twist. I told him he shouldn't have to be used to it, and he nodded as his eyes closed, worn out from spending the whole night trying to disappear. I went into the living room, picked up my phone, and saw 17 missed calls from my parents' number and 3 texts from Emily asking what on earth just happened, warning me that Frank was furious and telling me to call Mom back immediately. I set the phone face down, opened my laptop, logged into my banking app, and scrolled until I found the auto payment I'd set up 6 months earlier for Frank's country club dues, $180 a month that I'd agreed to cover when he retired and said money was tight, a payment that had quietly become automatic. I kept scrolling and saw other charges I'd stopped noticing, Emily's kids' activities, dance lessons for Lucy and soccer for Evan, for $100 a month, because family helps family, and then the phone plan, 5 lines, $220 a month, with me still listed as the primary account holder since college. I added it up in my head, $180 plus $400 plus $220, $800 a month for 6 months, $4,800, and that didn't even include the dinners, the birthdays, the random get-togethers where the check always slid my way. My phone lit up again with Frank calling, and I let it ring while staring at the screen showing the country club payment scheduled to draft again in 3 days, my cursor hovering over cancel autopay. Not tonight. I thought, let him deal with the restaurant bill first, let him figure out how to cover it, let him wonder what else might stop. I closed the laptop, checked on Ben sleeping peacefully down the hall, and told myself tomorrow I'd handle the rest. Tomorrow I'd set boundaries I should have drawn years ago, but tonight I just sat in the quiet with my son safe under my roof. The kid who'd been told he wasn't real family and somehow ended up being the only real family I had. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda asking me to call because Frank was very upset and saying this wasn't like me, and she was right, because the old me would have apologized, paid, smoothed things over, shrunk himself so Frank could feel bigger, but the old me hadn't watched his son accept exclusion like it was normal, and the new me was done, so I powered off my phone. The next morning at 9:47, someone was pounding on my apartment door hard enough to shake it. not knocking but pounding, while I stood at the stove flipping pancakes and Ben sat at the table in dinosaur pajamas working on his activity book. The pounding kept going. Ben asked if it was Grandpa, and I said probably. And when he asked if I was going to answer, I flipped another pancake and said after we eat. Frank's voice came through the door saying my name and insisting he knew I was inside, and I plated the pancakes, set one in front of Ben, and we ate slowly while Frank wore out his knuckles in the hallway. Only after the dishes were rinsed did I open the door, and Frank stood there red-faced in a golf polo and khakis, pushing past me the second it opened and demanding to know what the hell last night was about. I walked into the kitchen and started making coffee, and he followed, accusing me of embarrassing him and making him look like an idiot, so I asked calmly if he could afford it. And when he stopped short, I opened my laptop on the counter and turned it toward him, showing 6 months of auto payments for the country club, Emily's kids' activities, and the phone plan. He squinted at the numbers, his face draining white and then flushing red again, and I told him $4,800, not counting dinners. He said he didn't know about all of it, gesturing at the screen, and I told him he used it every day and never questioned it. And when he mentioned Lucy's dance classes, I reminded him he'd asked me to help last spring and never said to stop. I glanced at Ben, who picked up his plate without being asked and quietly disappeared into his room, and Frank waited until the door clicked shut before saying I should have said something, and I told him he should have noticed. I walked to the door, opened it, and Frank grabbed his keys and paused at the threshold, saying this wasn't over, and I told him yeah, it was, then closed and locked the door. Later we went to Riverside Park, Ben tearing off toward the jungle gym while I sat on a bench, and my phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. Uncle Mike saying Frank had borrowed $3,000 in July and hadn't paid it back, asking if everything was okay. I listened again and realized July was right when Frank asked me to cover the country club dues, meaning he hadn't been tight because of retirement, but because he was already in debt. I called Mike back, told him what happened at the restaurant, about the separate table and the payments I'd been covering, and after a long silence he said Frank had been telling him everything was fine and claiming he had consulting work, which I didn't think existed. Mike admitted the money was supposed to be for a car repair insurance wouldn't cover, and when I said I didn't know if the car was even fixed, Mike said paying for a club membership while owing family money was bad judgment and that canceling it was the right move, adding that whatever happened at that restaurant, he was on my side because kids don't get ranked. Ben ran back over asking for ice cream, and I said sure, so we stopped at the grocery store on the way home, Ben choosing chocolate chip, and at checkout I heard my name. Emily stood there in designer sunglasses and yoga pants with a cart full of organic groceries, forcing a smile at Ben, who waved but stayed close to me, and she told me the dance academy payment had declined and Lucy's costume wasn't paid for. I said that was unfortunate, and when her voice rose and she asked how that could be unfortunate after 3 months of practice, I told her she should pay for it. And when she demanded to know why I hadn't said anything, I asked why she hadn't checked. Ben tugged my sleeve and said he wanted to go, so I told him we were done here and started to move past Emily, just as she grabbed my arm. This was all because of Saturday, because my dad Frank looked at my 7-year-old son and told him he wasn't real family, and that's not some harmless slip of the tongue or a misunderstanding. Emily said he didn't mean it like that, and I asked her how exactly he did mean it, because I'd love to hear the polite, acceptable way to tell a kid he doesn't belong. She glanced at Ben and then back at me and asked if we could not have this conversation in front of him, and I reminded her that they had no problem doing it in front of him on Saturday, in the middle of a restaurant. Her face turned red and she said that wasn't fair, and I told her what wasn't fair was Lucy losing her solo or Evan missing soccer practice, but what really wasn't fair was my son being shoved to a separate table like he was an inconvenience. I walked away then, Ben's hand gripping mine tight, and in the car he stayed quiet until I asked if he was okay. He said Aunt Emily looked sad, and then he asked if it was our fault, and I told him no, that sometimes when you stop doing what people expect of you, they get upset, and that's their issue to deal with, not ours. He nodded like he wanted to believe me even if he wasn't all the way there yet. Once we were home, I made us lunch, simple grilled cheese, and while he ate I opened my laptop and pulled up the Elite Soccer Academy registration page, the camp he'd mentioned a few times before he stopped asking after I said maybe. $450 for 2 weeks of advanced training, and without overthinking it I filled in his name, his birthday, my contact info, and hit submit. He looked up and asked what I was doing, and I told him he was going to soccer camp, the good one, and his whole face lit up like I'd just flipped on a light. He hugged me so hard my coffee sloshed, thanked me over and over, and stared at the confirmation email like it might vanish if he blinked too long. That night, I couldn't sleep, lying there listening to Ben breathe through the wall, that soft, steady sound that reminded me how young he still was and how much he was still learning about what family meant. I'd cut off my parents, blocked my sister, erased them the same way they'd tried to erase him. And even though Maya said I was protecting us and Mike said I was finally setting boundaries, the house felt cold in the dark. I opened my phone and stared at Frank's blocked number, knowing one tap could undo it, knowing maybe he'd apologize, maybe we'd talk it out, maybe Ben could have grandparents again. My finger hovered there until I remembered Frank's smile when he said real grandkids, like my son was some kind of placeholder, and I set the phone down. Not tonight, maybe not ever, but the doubt stayed anyway, heavy and unmoving. Friday morning, I logged back into my banking app, found Emily's activity payments set to draft in 12 days, and canceled them. Then canceled the country club due scheduled for 3 days out, watching the confirmation emails roll in. I opened a new tab and booked a campsite at Riverside for the weekend, just the two of us and one tent. And when Ben wandered in during a commercial break and asked if we were really going camping, I told him yes, just us, and he grinned like it was the best news he'd heard all year. Frank texted saying the conversation wasn't finished, and I replied that it was, then blocked his number again. Saturday morning we left with no phones and no drama, just a cooler, a tent, and a kid who'd never built a campfire before, and I showed him how to stack the wood while he crouched there with his tongue sticking out in concentration. When I finally let him strike the match and the fire caught, his face lit up and he said he did it, and I told him he sure did. We ate burnt hot dogs and messy s'mores, laughed until he snorted, and lay in the tent staring up at the stars while he told me it was his favorite day ever and asked if we could do this every month, just us. Sunday night on the drive home, with Ben asleep in the back and camping gear rattling in the trunk, I opened a new savings account and labeled it his college fund, depositing $800 and setting it to auto-transfer every month, money that used to go to people who never showed up for him. Mike texted asking what kind of pie we wanted for Thanksgiving. I told him Ben liked apple, and when I showed Ben the message later, he smiled and hugged me, because that's what family does. They remember what you like, and they make you feel like you belong. 2 days later, on a quiet Tuesday evening, Ben sat at the kitchen table doing homework while I cooked dinner, and he slid a folder over to me and asked if I could sign it. And when I opened it and saw the permission slip waiting for my signature, I picked up the pen without hesitation. And then I saw it, right there in the folder, the family tree project made of construction paper and crayon, and at the center were 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, labeled me and Ben, and that was all there was. That was everything. No branches reaching upward, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles or cousins, just the two of us standing alone. I immediately thought about last year's project, how he'd drawn everyone, my parents, Emily, Lucy, Evan, the whole group packed together. And this year he hadn't crossed anyone out or scribbled in anger. He'd simply made a quiet choice, the kind only a 7-year-old makes, and decided that family trees don't include people who make you sit by yourself. I said his name and told him I noticed there were no grandparents. And without looking up from his math homework, he said the teacher told them to draw the people who made them feel safe. I asked if they didn't, and he shrugged and said Grandpa told him he wasn't real, so he didn't draw him. And it was so simple and so logical it knocked the air out of me. I signed the permission slip, closed the folder, and realized I'd taught him this lesson without ever saying it out loud, that when you aren't valued, you leave, and the fact that he'd learned it so well at 7 years old left me torn between pride and fear. Wednesday night Mike called and said Janet wanted us over for dinner, lasagna, and that he had something he wanted to show me, some old photo albums he'd found in the attic, and when I asked what kind of photos, he just said family stuff and told me to bring Ben. Thursday at 5:30 we pulled up to their house, the kind of warm, cluttered place where life spills out everywhere, photos on every wall and kids' artwork from decades ago still stuck to the fridge, and Janet hugged us both and told Ben she'd made garlic bread with extra butter, which earned her an instant grin. After dinner, while Ben played with Mike's old Legos on the floor, Mike brought out a worn leather photo album with a cracked spine and yellowing pages and told me it was from the years around my adoption. He opened it to the first page, and there I was at 3 years old on my first day home, holding my mom's hand while she cried happy tears, and on the next page Frank was holding me, both of us smiling wide, with my mom's handwriting underneath saying day 3, already inseparable. Mike turned the pages, and there were more photos. Frank teaching me to ride a bike, Frank at my kindergarten graduation, Frank helping me build a birdhouse, all of it before I turned 6, and then suddenly there was nothing, page after page of empty space. I flipped ahead and found a single photo 5 years later of my middle school graduation. Frank standing in the back row in a polo shirt with tired eyes and no smile. And Mike asked if I noticed the gap. 5 full years with nothing. He pointed to the last photo before the blank pages. Frank in a suit with me on his lap, both of us grinning, captioned Robert's promotion party, VP of Sales, and explained that Frank had been on top of the world that year, right before the company restructured and pushed him into early retirement at 49. Mike tapped the empty pages and said Frank stopped taking photos after that. And staring at those blanks, I realized there were 5 years where my dad hadn't vanished from my life so much as from his own. Mike told me quietly that Frank had chosen me once and fought for me, and that it had been real, and I took a few pictures of the pages on my phone before he surprised me by offering me the whole album. Ben wandered over and asked what it was, and when I showed him a picture of Frank holding me, he said Grandpa looked happy, and I told him he had been, once, and when Ben asked what happened, I said sometimes people change and forget who they used to be. Mike walked us out and said Frank had called him the day before asking if he'd seen me, and that he'd told him I was taking care of my son, which was all he needed to know, and I drove home with the album riding shotgun. I put it on my bookshelf, not hidden and not on display, just there, proof that my dad had once been different and had once chosen me before he forgot how. Friday afternoon at 3:15, I was early picking Ben up from school, parked at the curb watching kids flood out like an avalanche, and Ben came out with his backpack on and his head down, with Lucy right behind him. She sped up, said something I couldn't hear, and when Ben shook his head and kept walking, she grabbed his backpack, drawing the attention of other kids, and whatever she said next was sharp enough that I felt it from the car. Ben's shoulders folded inward, that same shrinking move, and I got out and called his name, and when he saw me the relief on his face was immediate. Lucy let go and smiled at me like nothing had happened, greeting me politely, but I didn't smile back and told Ben to wait in the car, which he did fast. I looked at Lucy, 8 years old and already learning how to hurt people, and asked what she'd said, and when she tried to dodge it I pressed until she admitted she told him he wasn't real family, and that's why he didn't sit with them. I crouched to her level and told her calmly that family isn't about blood, it's about showing up, and that right now the people around her were teaching her how to hurt others, and she didn't have to accept that lesson. I walked back to the car where Ben was buckled in and staring at his hands, and when I asked what Lucy said, he told me Grandpa told her mom he wasn't real, and that because I adopted him, he wasn't really a Morrison, and when he asked if I was going to leave him too, my heart split open. I told him no, never, that he was the realest thing in my life, and he nodded like he wanted to believe me even if he couldn't yet. We drove home quietly, and that night I didn't sleep because I finally understood that this wasn't just one cruel comment at a restaurant. It was something that had spread, permission passed down until a child felt entitled to weaponize it. And cutting it off hadn't been an overreaction, it had been necessary. On Monday of the 3rd week, my desk phone rang at work and reception told me there was a woman waiting to see me, Linda Morrison, saying she was my mother, no appointment, and she'd already been there for an hour. I stared at my computer screen with a deadline 4 hours away and told reception I'd be down in 5 minutes. And when I reached the lobby, my mom was sitting there looking smaller than I remembered, tired, clutching her purse like it was armor, standing up the second she saw me, and saying my name like she'd been holding it in for an hour. I called her mom, suggested we talk at the coffee shop across the street, 10 minutes, and we walked over without saying a word, ordered coffee, and sat tucked into a corner where she wrapped both hands around her cup and told me my father had been difficult all week. I said I could imagine, and when she said he didn't understand why I was doing this, I asked if he'd told her what he actually said to Noah, and she looked down and said he mentioned a misunderstanding about seating, which made my stomach tighten. I asked if that was really all he told her, and she said he was struggling, that retirement hadn't been easy and money was tight. And I told her I knew about Uncle Mike's $3,000 from July. Watching her go pale as I explained Mike had called me. I told her if Dad needed help he should have asked, not hidden it. Not had me paying for a country club while he owed his brother money, and she admitted she hadn't known about most of the payments. I reminded her that she'd sat there Saturday night and let Dad separate Noah, let him sit alone, and she said she didn't want to make a scene, and I told her the silence was the scene. She wiped her eyes and asked what she needed to do to fix this, and I told her to tell Dad the truth, that what he said was wrong, that Noah is family, and that adoption doesn't make a kid less. She stood up and said she understood, and when she turned to leave I told her if things changed, if Dad actually did the work, maybe we could talk someday, but not now. And when she asked how she'd know, I told her she'd know when Noah felt safe enough to draw her again. She nodded and left, and I sat in my car afterward for 20 minutes before going back inside, replaying her shaking hands and her words about silence, wondering if she was right. I thought about Noah's family tree with just me on it and how I'd told myself that was their fault, but I was the adult. I was the one who'd blocked numbers and canceled access, and Noah was only following my lead, which made me wonder if maybe I'd moved too fast on everything after the restaurant. That night, I texted Maya asking if I was being too harsh, and when she replied by asking me the same question back, I realized I didn't have an answer. A few days later, Mike texted asking me to call him, said it was about Frank, and when I did, he told me Dad was physically fine but mentally falling apart, and when I said I didn't feel bad, there was a pause before Mike said he was sending me something and hung up. A screenshot came through, a text thread where Frank admitted to breaking down in a store after seeing a dad laughing with his kid, saying he couldn't remember the last time Alex laughed with him, admitting he'd been blocked and deserved it, and saying he didn't know how to show up. I stared at that screen longer than I wanted to, feeling tired instead of angry, and told Mike it didn't change anything, and he said he didn't think it would, just thought I should know. Thanksgiving came at Mike and Janet's house in a loud, messy, joyful way, sisters arguing over pie, kids everywhere, toddlers crying over dinner rolls, and Noah at the kids' table laughing for real, doubled over while another kid told a ridiculous frog story. Janet handed me a glass of wine and said he fit right in, that I did too, and for once I believed it. Dinner was chaos without rankings or separate seats. Noah talking soccer with Mike, someone inviting him for a sleepover, me being judged into taking seconds of sweet potatoes, and afterward I watched Noah and Tyler tackle each other in the yard while Mike asked if it was okay that this was our Thanksgiving now. I told him it was more than okay, and when he said Frank had asked about us, I told him we were with family, because we were. Later, driving home with Noah asleep and happy in the back seat, he asked if this could be our Thanksgiving from now on, and I told him absolutely, laughing when he said he needed to practice for next year's tackle football. That night, I added another $800 to Noah's college fund and watched the balance grow, real money for real choices. And when I looked at the old photo album on my shelf with Frank smiling at a 3-year-old me, I understood the difference, that he'd chosen me once, but now I was choosing Noah every day, and that choice changed everything. By month 2, life had settled into a rhythm without them, filled with work, soccer practice, and Sunday dinners where Noah always had a seat at the table. I opened the college fund again and put in another $800, watching the balance tick up to $2,400, real money that meant real choices down the road. But even with that, the doubt never fully left. It just sat there quietly, waiting. December rolled in, 3rd week, and Mike called late, 11:47 at night, telling me he was at the hospital with Frank, and my stomach dropped before he even finished explaining it was a heart attack. Not massive, but not nothing either. That Janet and my mom were there, and Mom was asking for me. I looked down the hall at Ben's door, closed and quiet, and told Mike I couldn't drag a sleeping 7-year-old to a hospital at midnight, and he said he understood, that Frank was stable and awake, and I told him I'd think about it. I didn't go that night or the next morning, but I did send a card to the hospital, plain white from Walgreens, nothing fancy, with just 3 words inside. Get well, think. Mom called after Frank read it, and I let it go to voicemail, listening later as she thanked me and said Frank cried and wanted to see me when I was ready, no pressure. Frank came home 2 weeks later, and Mike kept me in the loop about meds, diet changes, doctors telling him to reduce stress, and when the doctor asked what triggered it, Frank said family estrangement, and the doctor told him that would do it. January came and Ben's soccer team made the playoffs, and every Saturday we practiced in the park, sometimes with Mike and Tyler tagging along. And Ben was getting really good, focused, and happy in a way that made my chest ache. He stopped asking about Grandpa, stopped wondering about holidays or why they weren't invited anymore. And that hurt worse than the restaurant ever did, because no kid should learn that lesson so young. February brought Ben's 8th birthday, a small party at our place with his teammates, school friends, Mike and Janet. No invite to my parents and no expectation they'd show up. But that morning a package arrived addressed to Ben. Inside was a pro-quality soccer jersey, number 12, and a printed photo of Frank at Ben's school gym, standing at an equipment drive table writing a check, other parents around him, and on the back, in Frank's handwriting, it said he'd donated $200 for kids who couldn't afford cleats and didn't tell anyone he was Ben's grandfather, that he just wanted to help. The card said happy 8th birthday and mentioned how Ben once said number 12 mattered because that's how old he'd be when he went pro, something he'd said at 5, and Frank wrote that he'd been listening back then and was sorry he stopped. I stared at the photo, realizing Frank had gone to Ben's school quietly, without credit, just showing up the way I'd been doing for years, and maybe he'd learned that the hard way. Ben came over, I handed him the jersey, and he pulled it on immediately, reading the card and staring at the picture, asking why Grandpa hadn't said hi, and I told him I didn't know. And when he asked if Grandpa was sorry, I looked at the careful handwriting, the exact size and number of the jersey, and said I thought he was trying. Ben asked if trying was enough, and I told him I didn't know yet, but maybe we could find out together, and he hugged me without taking the jersey off. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the couch staring at my phone. Frank's number still blocked after 3 months of feeling safe and in control, but realizing control wasn't healing and walls weren't the same thing as boundaries. So I unblocked the number without calling or texting, just leaving the door cracked. 3 days later the phone rang, and it was Frank, and I let it ring a few times while Ben played in his room wearing that jersey like it was armor, knowing I could ignore it or answer, not because Frank deserved it, but because I deserved the choice. I picked up, said hello, listened to his breathing and his voice when he finally said my name, told me he wasn't sure I'd answer, and I said I wasn't sure either, and after a pause he told me he'd been thinking a lot since the hospital and that Mike knew he was in counseling, that he wasn't doing it for credit, but because it was right, because he'd been wrong. I told him he'd said something cruel to a 7-year-old, not just wrong, and he agreed, saying it took 8 sessions for him to understand he'd been angry for years, mostly at himself, for not being enough, not smart enough to keep his job, not successful enough to avoid needing help, not important enough for people to call him for anything other than money, and that he took it out on a kid because that was easier than admitting he felt like a failure. I asked him what he wanted from me, and after a long silence he said he wanted a chance to prove he'd changed, to meet Ben again, to be the grandfather he should have been, and I told him that wasn't up to me, that it was up to Ben, and that a 7-year-old doesn't owe anyone forgiveness. I told him straight that if he messed this up, if he said even one thing that made Noah feel smaller or less than, we were done for good with no second chances. And he said he understood, and I told him this wasn't about him anyway, that I was doing it because Noah asked me the week before if grandparents could change. His voice cracked when he asked what I'd told Noah, and I said I didn't know, but maybe we'd find out. And after a long pause he thanked me and said it was more than he deserved, and I agreed before hanging up and staring at the phone in my hand. Maya was standing in the doorway, having heard everything, and asked if I was sure about this, and I told her no, but I was choosing it anyway, and she smiled and said that was growth, the terrifying kind, and I pulled her close and told her it really was. The next week Noah and I were back at the same park from months earlier, only this time I had his new bike with me, the one I bought using money that used to disappear into country club dues, and there were no training wheels because he'd asked me to take them off. I asked if he was sure, and he said he was, pointing out that Tyler didn't have training wheels, and when I reminded him Tyler wasn't the standard, he said he knew but still wanted to try. I held the back of the seat and ran alongside him, telling him to keep pedaling, and he wobbled, caught himself, wobbled again, and I kept telling him I was right there. He started pedaling faster, found his balance, and slowly pulled ahead, and at some point I let go without him noticing, and he just kept riding, 50 feet, then 100, until he finally looked back and realized he was doing it on his own. He didn't fall, didn't panic, just kept going, turned around, and rode back to me grinning like he'd discovered fire, yelling that he did it. And I told him I saw, because I had. He rode circles around me laughing, completely free, and then asked if I thought Grandpa had really changed, and I watched him ride, confident and strong, 7 years old, and already figuring out that people were complicated. And I told him I thought Grandpa was trying, and that was a start. He asked if we were going to see him, and I said maybe, when he was ready, and only if he wanted to. And when he admitted he might be scared, I told him I'd be right there, just like with the bike, holding on until he was ready for me to let go. And he nodded, rode another lap, and said maybe, which felt like a good place to begin. My phone buzzed with a text from my mom asking if they could see me sometime when I was ready and saying there was no pressure, and I typed back not yet, but maybe, and she replied right away with thank you. That's enough, and I put the phone away. I watched Noah ride, watched him fall once and get back up without tears and take off again. And I thought about how 7 months earlier he'd been sitting at a separate table being told he wasn't real. And now he was here riding a bike paid for with reclaimed money, part of a family that chose him every single day. Maybe the old family would come back someday if they did the work and if Noah decided they'd earned it, but we didn't need them to be whole because we already were. Noah rode past me again and told me to watch. Let go of the handlebars for just a second, wobbled, grabbed them again, and looked back at me glowing, asking if I saw, and I told him I did, and I kept watching as he rode on. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost, only what I'd built, just the two of us, a real family. Not perfect, not certain, marked up with scars, but real, and that was enough.